Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and on this channel I upload all sorts of videos relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you know whenever I upload a new video. So for today's case, I am discussing one that has kind of gone by different names. Most commonly it's referred to the case of the girl on Church Hill. But before we get started, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the girl on Church Hill. This case begins on June the 12th in the year of 1977 when a man named George Charles had been driving through a place called Buckingham Township in Bucks County, Pennsylvania with his son Mark. The pair had been driving in search of a stream located at the base of what was known as Buckingham Mountain or Church Hill. While the pair were out driving along this road, George had spotted something that had caught his eye in amongst a pile of dead leaves and sort of undergrowth. On a first glance, Mark had believed that he'd seen a nude body and decided to drive away, continuing their errands, putting it down to some sort of normal explanation. But the sighting hadn't sat right with Mark, and the pair decided to turn back and head back in the direction of where they'd spotted this unusual sighting. At the bottom of the steep slope on the north face of the hill, they'd spotted the nude body of a woman. When they'd been certain of what it was that they had seen, they'd driven in the direction of the next home up the hill and asked the owner of the house to call the police, reporting exactly what they had found. Local officers had arrived in the area within 15 minutes and had initially checked for any indication of the woman being alive, although they soon confirmed that she was deceased. And not long after this, the whole area was marked off and teams of law enforcement had arrived. It had been initially clear to the investigators that the victim had not died in the location in which her remains were found, and so they immediately started knocking on the doors of the local residents located up the hill in order to determine whether any of the residents in the area were missing or had known of someone in the area, but none of them were missing. No one had any clue of who this could be. According to all of these residents, none of them had heard anything suspicious in the area, and all of the local residents had appeared to be completely shocked by the news of the discovery. Investigators had collected anything and everything that was found in the area of the remains in the hopes that some of them may have turned out to be pieces of evidence that could give them an indication of who this woman was and what had happened to her. The on-scene examination of the remains had provided a rough estimate of her age, placing her at being somewhere between 20 and 30 years of age, and she had also been around 5'5" tall and 130 pounds. The woman had frizzy brown shoulder-length hair, pierced ears and silver painted fingernails. She had been found face down wearing no clothing, only a yellow gold ring with the word love engraved into it with small diamonds on the O. Because of the nature of the discovery of the remains, the authorities had already been under the impression they were dealing with a murder case or something involving foul play, but when the remains were moved and they were turned so that they were lying face up, they very quickly realised that they were dealing with a complete mutilation. During the official post-mortem carried out on the remains, it was determined that her age had been narrowed down to somewhere between 21 and 25 years old. They noted that there had been a number of small ant bites and marks along the backside of the remains, which had given them the impression that the victim had been dragged along the ground at some point. The unknown victim had been disemboweled by her killer, and it was noted that the wound had been made with extreme precision. They found that nearly all of the woman's lower internal organs had been removed by the killer, as well as them finding a towel in the wound, and she had also suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest. It was later determined that the woman had been slightly intoxicated at the time of her death, as there had been a relatively small amount of alcohol in her system. One of the most concerning findings found during the post-mortem had been the multiple small marks on her thumb and pinky fingers, which had given the impression that they were defensive wounds. There was evidence that suggested on the back of her skull it had been bruised and hemorrhaged, but the skull itself hadn't been damaged, meaning that she had suffered a blow to the head, but this would have only injured or possibly knocked her unconscious. And what seemed so concerning to the authorities is that all of these signs pointed towards the victim being alive at the time of her her being disemboweled. The coroner who carried out the post-mortem had stated that he believed the woman had been struck a total of 3 times on the back of her head and had likely attempted to defend herself while feeling dazed during the attack. It was believed that she had died somewhere between 1:30 p.m. on the 10th of June and 1:30 p.m. on the 12th of June in 1977, meaning the remains were likely found between 12 and 48 hours after her death. At this same time, authorities were still working on establishing an identity for this unknown woman. There had been no local missing persons reports that matched the description of the victim, and authorities had collected both fingerprints and dental records in the hopes that these could be matched to some on file. The following day, on the 13th of June, the authorities had enlisted the help of social media outlets in an attempt to identify this young woman. These news outlets had distributed an image of the woman and featured a number of details around the woman's physical appearance. Initially, there had been a few calls sent in telling the authorities that they believed a woman referred to as a witch may be involved. This woman lived in the nearby area of Yardley and owned a palm reading company with her husband, who had also once been a member of a motorcycle gang. Another call that was sent in had followed the same line, as they'd stated that they'd witnessed a group of students from the nearby Temple University practicing what they believed had been witchcraft at the top of Church Hill in the previous months. It's worth noting that at the top of Church Hill was a church then listed as a historical landmark since it was no longer in use, but it was a popular spot for teenagers to go and drink and mess around like a lot of teenagers do. Aside from these claims of witchcraft being practiced in the area, the majority of the phone calls had been reporting potential identities of the unknown woman. At this same time, a resident in Bristol Township had seen the news article on the unidentified victim found at the bottom of Church Hill and went in search of his own daughter. He'd headed to number 927 Spring Street, where his daughter had been living at the time, and as he pulled into the car park attached to the building, he'd seen 2 young men and a young woman entering the main door to the apartment building. He had addressed the group to stop them and asked them if they'd seen his daughter in the recent few days, and as it would turn out, none of them had. They'd all said that they'd simply assumed that she'd gone on a short trip away last minute, as it wouldn't be the first time that she'd done something like that. In response, the man had handed the group the newspaper featuring the article of the unidentified woman's remains being discovered, which had depicted an image of the victim lying with their eyes closed. It appeared as though the group had shared their belief that the woman in the photograph had been this man's daughter, but in response, the father had said that he wanted to wait just a few more days in case they were wrong and that his daughter had contacted him. Rather than waiting, though, the young woman of this group, whose name was Kathy East, had decided to contact the police later that day. As it would turn out, in the evening of that Monday, the man who'd been in search of his daughter, a man named Francis Ritterson, his wife and his son, had visited the courthouse in Doylestown in search of the on-shift county detectives, with the concern that the victim discovered at the bottom of Church Hill was his daughter. From here, they were taken to the morgue located in the Doylestown Hospital, and this is where they positively identified the unidentified victim as being 20-year-old Shaun Eileen Ritterson. Once the victim was given a name and this was confirmed, the authorities had set out in search of answers as to what had happened to this young woman. On Friday the 10th of June 1977, it was known that Shaun Ritterson had been out with a group of friends in a bar called the Capri in Bristol Township. A local band was performing that night and the building was full of young people drinking and smoking. It was known that at some point during the evening, Shaun had been stood alone in an area holding her drink after having taken some drugs with her friends. According to the friends that had been with her, they had all noticed her standing alone, looking as though she appeared quite down, but none of them had actually gotten around to going over to her and checking up on her, since they were all too preoccupied in this busy and loud bar. A few other people in the bar at the same time had told the authorities that they had briefly spoken to Shaun, but each encounter had been the result of her looking for someone to sell drugs. But after that night, Shaun did not return to her home. Shaun Ritterson had moved into her apartment at 927 Spring Street around 3 weeks before her disappearance with an old friend of hers. In the past, Shaun had struggled to maintain steady employment, but according to her father, they had both agreed that she could move out into her own apartment and out of the family home. When Shaun didn't return home to her apartment that night, and no one had heard from her for quite some time, none of her friends had seemingly thought much of it. It was apparently not unusual for her to just sort of disappear for short periods of time and go on last-minute trips. Some sources stated that Francis Ritterson had heard rumours of Shaun's death being related to some form of witchcraft, but he had told the authorities that he didn't believe she was involved in anything of the sorts. According to him, SHAUN had been raised Catholic, and according to her parents, despite the fact that she wouldn't join them at Mass weekly, she'd always been one to respect her and her family's religion. Investigators did soon discover that there had been a previous incident in which SHAUN had chosen to run away from her family home when she was just 16 years old. At the time, it was discovered that SHAUN and two of her friends had decided to make plans to start a new life together in Florida, and when they'd all run away from their homes, the initial belief was that this is where they had gone. However, at the time, the authorities were very quick to discover that the three teenagers hadn't even left the county. Instead, they were living with a 45-year-old man in Bristol Township. When SHAUN was taken to juvenile court and asked to explain her reasons for why she wanted to run away, she simply stated that she wasn't happy with the curfew that her parents had set for her and that she didn't get along with her sister. There were a few other runaway attempts that same year, and each time she was found to be staying with her friend Donna Stevenson and Donna's fiance, a man named Richard Wheeler. Over the next few years, she was known to move about out of dislike aimed towards being at her family's home, sometimes with her staying at her friend's or sometimes at her uncle's house in Croydon. Not long after this, SHAUN had managed to find herself an arrangement with a local woman who offered her a place to stay in her apartment in exchange for SHAUN babysitting her children. This hadn't lasted long, as one day the woman had returned home to her apartment to find SHAUN and another girl sifting through her jewellery collection and two young men hiding in the closet. As I said previously, she just typically struggled to maintain a steady job, since a lot of the time her employment would be terminated following incidents where she would refuse to work. In an attempt to continue searching for the killer of SHAUN Ritterson, police had searched through her apartment. They mostly found a number of personal belongings, including a number of notes and letters, a calendar with a bunch of the dates marked, and some clothing items. When they'd searched through the rubbish bin, they found $60 in cash in the bottom. They found there had been a number of brown stains on both her nightgown and her bed sheets, and so swabs were collected from each of these in hopes of understanding what these stains were and if they were potentially blood. In her apartment, there had been a man's shirt with a patch reading Warminster Heights Development Corp written on it. When the authorities had attempted to research what this could potentially mean, they found very little to pretty much no information that could be of use. Along with the stains found on the nightgown and the bed sheets, there were multiple other dried red stains found around the apartment. When the samples from each of these were collected and tested, they were discovered to contain no blood traces, but rather suggested that they had been sort of miscellaneous food stains. Similarly, in the sink, they had collected two unidentified pieces of tissue, which were later confirmed to be pieces of cooked meat. The search of the apartment seemed to provide little useful information into understanding what had happened to 20-year-old SHAUN Ritterson. Authorities knew that she had been at the bar called the Capri on the night before her death, and this wasn't an unusual thing for her, and her parents confirmed that her closest friend had been Donna Stevenson, the same Donna who she had run away with when she was younger. However, when the authorities had spoken to Donna directly, Donna had denied that the pair had been very close and placed emphasis on the fact that they were just friends. And they soon realised that this emphasis was common amongst all of her friends. All of these friends were either not all that close to her, or they didn't want to be thought of as such by the authorities. Circling back to SHAUN's roommate, as he remained a person of interest to the authorities from a relatively early point in the investigation, SHAUN and her roommate, who was called Richard Bones Gittins, had been friends since high school, and at one point when SHAUN was around 17 years old, she temporarily lived with Richard and his girlfriend. Richard Gittins was known to have a particularly unsavoury past, as around the same time of SHAUN living with the pair, Richard was found to have gotten into a fight with another teenager, which ended with the other boy being stabbed by Gittins. And because of this incident in particular, he was sent away to youth camp. When the authorities had arrived at SHAUN's apartment in search of the place and in the hopes of speaking to her roommate, they found no sign of him. He was later found at his mother's home 3 days after the discovery of SHAUN's remains, and he was found to have had a black eye and numerous scratches across his face. Because of this and his known violent past, police were already considering the likelihood of him being involved in SHAUN's death. According to Richard, 2 weeks prior to her death, SHAUN had approached him while he was living out of his car, and she'd asked him to be her roommate in exchange for them splitting the costs of living. He went as far to tell the authorities that he was convinced that SHAUN's family didn't like the pair of them living together, in particular SHAUN's uncle, who had told SHAUN directly that he didn't like the idea of her living alone with a male. Richard maintained that him and SHAUN were just friends and roommates and that there was no sexual component to their friendship. The apartment that they lived in had only one bed, and so Richard would sleep on the sofa unless SHAUN was away for whatever reason, in which case he would be allowed to sleep in the bed. According to Richard, the last time he had seen SHAUN had been the Friday before the discovery of her remains, and even on that day he said that she'd pretty much slept in her bed the entire day. When it had reached the evening time, he had gone in to wake SHAUN up before then heading out to meet a group of friends of his at a place called the Suburban Lounge. While he was out with his friends drinking, they decided that they wanted to get their hands on some heavy drugs, and Richard had told his friends that his roommate would likely know where they could get some. And so they'd all driven from this Suburban Lounge to the apartment, and this is where SHAUN and her friend Donna had joined the group. According to Richard, Donna had purchased some drugs from someone near the Delaware Valley Hospital, and then from here they all drove back to the apartment. Each person there had taken a portion of the drugs that they had purchased, with some being saved for a friend that was waiting for them at the Suburban Lounge. The group, now high, had then headed back to the bar at around 8:30 p.m, and Richard said that at around this time Donna and SHAUN had been speaking to some men alone outside the bar. At somewhere before 10 p.m, Richard and the two other men that he was with had left the bar to pick up a friend at the nearby Oxford Valley Mall, and left Donna and SHAUN outside talking to these men as they would be returning shortly. And when they returned around 30 minutes later, the two girls were still there. According to Richard, he had not been with SHAUN for much longer that night, as he'd gone to another bar and he'd continued drinking. He said that at around 2 a.m, he remembered an unknown man helping him walk home as he was overly intoxicated, and that he'd tripped and fallen on the hard floor, and this is how he'd managed to get himself a black eye and scratches all over his face. When he'd made it back to the apartment, there had been no sign of SHAUN, but he had assumed that she was just still out with some friends. He'd woken up the following morning at around 11 a.m, but he was still alone in the apartment, and so he'd gotten himself ready and then walked to the nearby doctor's office just to get his wounds looked at. He'd returned home just before 3 p.m. and found no sign of SHAUN, and then not long after this, Donna had arrived at the apartment in search for her. Neither friend of SHAUN's had seemingly been concerned because of her previous behaviours, and according to Richard, the following few days after this, he'd spent out pretty much the entire time with his friends drinking. After a few days, the police had managed to seek out a group of witnesses who could confirm Richard Gittins' account of those few days, and because of this, he was ruled out as a suspect. Because of the details that Richard Gittins had provided the authorities, they soon had some other avenues for them to explore. They discovered that there had been a fight somewhere in the area of SHAUN's apartment building, and as it would turn out, this had been involving a known local drug dealer who had claimed that SHAUN had stolen money from her. A friend of SHAUN's named Patricia Darms had spoken to the authorities and told them that she knew SHAUN had visited the area of Church Hill on multiple occasions in the past. It was a popular activity for local teenagers to swim up the quarry in the area of Church Hill or drink and smoke in the cemetery on the top. This girl had also told them that there was an urban legend spread around by the local teenagers where they would attempt to race the devil in the cemetery. The story went that if you sprinted across the cemetery and you could feel the wind on your back, then you were beaten by the devil and that you would soon face your death, and this seemingly was a legend that the local teens would sort of take much enjoyment in just trying. Because of this knowledge that SHAUN had previously visited the area of Church Hill, as well as most likely having swam in the quarry in the area, they searched the quarry and the nearby smaller areas of water. They also decided to search the railroad tracks that meet the base of the hill in the hopes that any of these areas may have been somewhere that SHAUN had decided to visit prior to her death, and there may be evidence to suggest such, but they found no new evidence at any of these places. They did find a few items of clothing and a bedding quilt, but each of these items were determined to have not been related to SHAUN's case. As the authorities had continued to interview the friends and acquaintances of SHAUN, they were able to start piecing together elements of her final day prior to her death. They discovered that in addition to the heroin that she'd split with 5 others as Richard Gittins had informed the police of, SHAUN had later purchased herself some more. A number of people who had seen SHAUN that night in the bars she was known to have visited had described her as being visibly high. It was known that at one of the bars in particular, which was the Capri, her cousin had been the doorman on that night, and This would provide some form of explanation as to how she was able to enter the bar while being so visibly high. According to Shaun's cousin, a John Jack Lister, he had seen Shaun, Donna and some of their other friends by the jukebox at one point in the evening. He'd said that at around this same point he had noticed that Shaun was looking rather down and particularly depressed, and then he had seen Shaun leave the bar with an unknown man somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m. As the pair left the bar, Lister had addressed the man and told him to be careful with his cousin, which he then appeared to receive a nasty look in response from the man. According to John Lister, this unknown man had been Caucasian and had stood around 5 foot 8 inches tall, with long shoulder-length dark brown hair. He also said that he was rather thin in appearance. Investigators set out in an attempt to match the described man to the locals through known criminal records as well as old high school yearbook images, but sadly they didn't appear to have much luck with this. There were multiple known criminals that were considered as potential suspects and interviewed. One of these had been a man named James Thomas McCann, who was released from prison on the 7th of June, just a few days prior to Shaun's murder. He'd been serving in prison at the time after he was found guilty of murdering a woman in 1960 after she had rejected his advances in a nightclub, and this attack had been particularly disturbing as well, as he had further disemboweled and removed the head of the victim. Detectives had interviewed McCann in relation to Shaun's murder, but he was soon ruled out as a suspect once it was discovered that he had been staying in a halfway house for ex-convicts where there were multiple witnesses proving that he was present, as well as the authorities concluding that his mental state would prevent him from committing another murder, although I couldn't really find a lot more information as to what this was referring to. Another known criminal they spoke to had been a man named John Allen Campbell. When he was 17, he had sexually assaulted and killed a young woman in Massachusetts, and upon his more recent release from prison, he had moved to a place called Lower Southampton. When he was interviewed, authorities had ultimately determined that the details of the murder he was convicted for had not matched the details of Shaun's case, and also they'd gotten the strong impression that Campbell had been successfully rehabilitated into society following his release. One main theory that had appeared to be a popular one to the authorities at the time had been the possibility of Shaun having been pregnant at the time of her murder. This theory suggested that the way in which her remains were found could be the result of someone wanting to remove the unborn child from her body so that no one would find out. From the reports provided by a number of Shaun's acquaintances and friends, there were numerous possibilities of men that Shaun may have been involved with, and so each of these men were interviewed as potentially being connected. There was allegedly one man in particular that Shaun would often tell her friends about, saying that she was going to marry him, but none of them knew his name. The origin of the love ring that she was found wearing was considered as possibly being related to this, but the detectives weren't able to trace this ring back to anywhere or anyone in particular. There was one person in particular that the authorities had appeared to turn their attention to, and this had been Shaun's uncle, Harry Ritterson. Harry had been present for a lot of the initial investigation, including being in the presence of Shaun's parents when they had officially identified the remains. He'd also provided a number of details in the initial interview, including the mention of her roommate, who he was not a fan of. According to some of the sources that I came across, there was one incident in particular at Shaun's funeral that had piqued the interest of a number of investigators, as they just deemed it as particularly unusual. While at Shaun's funeral, it was recorded that Harry had asked his and Francis's brother Charles what he would do if he found out who the killer was. There was no indication of what the brother had responded, but Harry had followed by saying, even if someone in the family had done it. And this is obviously nothing close to a confession, but it apparently struck some people as just unusual. As a result of this, the focus did appear to be on Harry Ritterson, and there were even reports of detectives following him daily just to keep track of his movements. It was known that Shaun and Harry did have a good relationship, as she would often turn to him when she was in trouble or if she needed a place to stay. Investigators had also seemingly taken the knowledge that Harry did have a preference for meeting younger women following his divorce in 1973 as something to potentially support this theory. Around a week after the discovery of Shaun's remains, the records of a motel called the Del Valle Motel, which was located in the nearby area, were searched after they discovered a blank piece of paper with the letterhead being from this particular local motel. And these records had showed that Shaun had booked a motel room for 2 people on the 7th of May, having signed in to the motel at around 1:23 a.m. She'd been given access to room number 22, which had cost her a total of $19.10. The next known movement from that room had been the following morning, when the occupant of the room had made a phone call but found the line to be busy, and so the call was dropped. As it would turn out, the number that had been dialed from this motel room had been to Harry Ritterson's home. Initially, Harry had denied having spent any time in the area in which Shaun's remains were found, but these were soon disputed by family members who had recalled numerous occasions in which he had visited a bar called Rendezvous in the area. He eventually had admitted to this, but he did not mention that he had visited there on multiple occasions to drink with Shaun, as his family had informed the authorities at a later point. When authorities had gone back to Shaun's roommate to ask him what he could remember about Shaun and her uncle and their relationship, he remembered there had been a quiet argument the pair had had outside of Shaun's apartment not long before her death. He believed that this argument had been about money, and it had ended with Shaun calling him a jerk. The next move the authorities had taken had been to speak to a friend of Harry's who had allegedly been one of the people who could confirm his alibi on the weekend of Shaun's murder. This man, Raymond Albright, had said that he'd been inside Tunic's bar in Newportville on June the 11th when Harry and his girlfriend, a woman named Jackie LaSalle, had entered at around midday. The 3 of them had then decided that they wanted to go to the Poconos, where they stopped on the way to buy some alcohol. According to Albright, at one point Harry had mentioned to the pair about Church Hill nearby and suggested that the 3 visit there while in the area. 3 of them had allegedly visited the church on the top of the hill when Harry briefly left the other 2 inside the abandoned church to relieve himself outside. After the detour, the 3 had returned to their car and started back on their journey, where they stopped again on the outskirts of Upper Bucks to drink again. According to Albright, they had continued driving north in stints broken up by stops for alcohol until they realised that they were lost and decided to book a hotel room. He said that they had started their drive home the following morning, where Harry had dropped him off at his truck parked at the bar somewhere between midday and 1 p.m. On July the 25th, 1977, Harry Ritterson was called in to take part in a polygraph test. He had been asked to recount what he had done between the dates of June the 10th and June the 12th, and he initially started by stating that he had last spoken to Shaun on the 9th when she had called him and invited him out partying, which he had refused. Harry had then continued to recount a story that seemingly matched the one provided by Raymond Albright. However, there was one seemingly very vastly different detail. On the last night that Shaun was seen alive, Harry Ritterson had claimed that he was at the Croydon bar with Raymond Albright until the early hours of the morning, but according to the account given by Albright, he didn't meet up with Harry until the following day. It was ultimately recorded that Harry Ritterson had failed the polygraph test, although it's believed that upon learning of this, he had accused the authorities present of tampering with the machine so that he would appear guilty. And by the end of the summer months of 1977, Harry Ritterson had remained the prime suspect in the murder of Shaun Ritterson. Over the years, there have been numerous other leads offered and rumours that paint other individuals as being potentially involved in her death, but Shaun's murder remains a huge mystery to this day. From what I can gather, the remaining DNA evidence stored in the original files of the case have since been revisited by the authorities to be retested using the modern and updated methods, but I've yet to find any updates of this. So if you do know of any other updates or theories, then please do let me know down below. Like I said, I'm always trying to build on whatever I could find through my own research. So that is where I'm going to end today's video. If you do have any thoughts on this case, then please do leave it in the comments down below, but as always, please do be respectful of other people's opinions. My heart goes out to Shaun's family, who all these years later still have no answers for Shaun's death, and I do hope one day that some answers can be found. But thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you all found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.